So I wanted to interview someone who has both backgrounds, taking care of Crohn's symptoms with the regular medicine and also with German new medicine. So you would have this perfect perspective on both of them.
Hmm.
Um, so I want to start with that, right? How did you do before you knew German new medicine?
In college, that is when my Crohn's symptoms started to act up. I had diarrhea my whole entire life, like all the time. It was just normal to me. I was never put in the hospital or anything like that. So the one symptom that cropped up that was a lot of fun was my perianal fistula. And so it's like a second asshole essentially, and it just oozes pus and blood. And I was a still a virgin, so I was like, I know this isn't an ST. Like, what is going on down there? And it was just disgusting and awful. And so that's how it got serious. And so we went to the doctor and we did the blood test and all that and got the MRIs. I almost peed my pants going to get my MRI because they made me drink so much water, getting the colonoscopy. I think we've all been there. But yeah, they did that. They did the colonoscopy. They didn't see anything. And then they did the MRI. And in my small intestine, there was like fistulas everywhere in my small intestine. So that was bad. And they said it was a pretty bad case. Yet I didn't have horrible symptoms. They wanted to put me on Remicade. I was like, no, I'm not going to go on Remicade. I asked them the logical questions like, hey, do you guys know what the root cause is? No. Are you guys curious? No, not really. And so I ended up going on pills, and that worked for a little bit, but eventually the symptoms came back, and that's when I went down the holistic route, and it was like another 5 years until I discovered German new medicine.
Mhm. And what did you do before that? Like, how did you take care of your symptoms?
Just ignored them. They weren't that bad.
Did you go on a special diet, anything like that?
Growing up, I just ate whatever I wanted. I wasn't concerned about it at all. I wasn't concerned about my digestion at all. I was pretty skinny growing up. When things started to get serious after college, I was like, okay, these drugs aren't working. And so I eventually caved and I went on Remicade for a year. About after a year of Remicade, I wasn't seeing any results. And I got stuck with a Remicade bill, like a $5,000 bill. And I was like, oh my God, like I'm not paying. I can't pay for this. And I'm not going to pay for this because this did absolutely nothing for me. And so that's what kind of spurred me to start trying diets. That is when my food intolerances started, is when I started going on diets. I did the specific carbohydrate diet. I did the GAPS diet, and luckily I never fall into the vegan or the vegetarian trap. And I eventually I found the Weston A. Price diet. I found the Weston A. Price diet pretty soon into that process, which was uh, good, a good diet to be on for a while, but it still never fixed my symptoms.
All right. So when did you realize those symptoms might have had an emotional root?
Not until just recently. I did a Weston A. Price diet and ancestral diet for a very long time, and if you would have asked me if stress caused digestive issues, I would have laughed and probably said something pretty mean. It was the furthest thing from my mind. And luckily, a few students were brave enough to tell me about German new medicine. And the first few people who told me about it, I was like, "You're crazy, get out of here." But eventually, I saw the truth in it. I saw the brain CT scans, and I saw that Dr. Hammer had like a 90% success rate with terminal cancer. And I took the dive and I learned the five biological laws, and it just became so clear.
So what I like about German new medicine is that when, doctors say it's just stress, it doesn't give you an explanation of what
Yeah.
what exactly is stressing you, because there's actually a one particular situation that's stressing you, that's causing you your
Hmm.
symptoms, and each one has its own biological program, and each has its own symptoms. So that's what I like about German new medicine. So what
Hmm.
are the symptoms of Well, I would say, what is the conflict? What's the stress that's causing Crohn's?
So Crohn's in itself is a very confusing term because it's supposed to mean inflammation anywhere from mouth to butthole, but normally it gets diagnosed as somebody with inflammation in the small intestine. And so there's a few different conflict themes that are argued amongst, but for me it was definitely indigestible anger, and there's also a a conflict theme that really resonates with me a lot. It's not getting what you deserve, and being angry and frustrated about it. And I had a lot of indigestible anger in my life for sure, in two areas. And the big reason why I had a hard time accepting that stress was causing my Crohn's symptoms is because I never really had like a big cataclysmic event that sparked all my symptoms. It was very slow, like drip fed to me, like over the course of my life.
So that indigestible anger, tell me more about, I guess, an example in your own life or in someone else's life. What was it? What does it mean? Like, how does it look like in real life?
I was just angry at a lot of things. Like if I couldn't find my shoes before going out the door and I was going to be late for something, I'd be like cussing under my breath or cussing in my mind. I like just be angry. Like that was my default reaction, like defense mechanism or problem solving tool. Like I was just indigestible anger at it could be almost anything. But I noticed that my worst flare, like the worst flare that I ever had, where I was like stuck in bed for a week and I almost went to the doctor, was after a breakup. And so I was like living with a girlfriend at the time. Like stress was through the roof. I've never been this stressed out. And we were trying to separate, and there was just this big mess. We ended up going like on a vacation together that we had planned or something like that, and we kind of agreed to like set our differences aside and like enjoy the vacation. And a few days into the vacation, I was sicker than a dog. And what was happening is like while we were fighting out, my gut was developing extra gut cells to digest this situation or digest women. And and when it finally got resolved, us coming to this peace agreement, the body just let go of those extra gut cells, and it was a miserable process. And of course we went on vacation, and so I just couldn't help myself, and I ate all these foods, and I blamed the foods. And it was probably a combination of both the foods, because I was perceiving the foods as hard to digest at the time, and then I was also going through that was probably like one of the most stressful events in my life, that going through that breakup. I was
So
at the peak of my food craze at that time too.
so you touched a little bit on this in explaining about in German New Medicine, you went through two phases. One was the active phase, and then you went into the healing phase.
Hmm.
So talk to me more about the healing phase for now, and then we'll go and you'll explain what is the active phase and how does active phase look like and feel like for someone who's going through it.
When you're going through the conflict active phase for the small intestines, you're not going to notice the symptoms. The cell proliferation is not noticeable. The only symptoms that you will notice is that you might have insomnia. You'll just have like general stressed out symptoms, like I can't eat, I can't sleep, I'm obsessing about the problem. It's when the conflict gets resolved, that is when the body gets rid of those extra gut cells, and you're going to get symptoms like diarrhea, blood in the stool, mucus in the stool, cramping, pain, bloating, gas. And some other conflict active symptoms could be constipation, bloating as well. Most of my symptoms were diarrhea and gut pain.
So there's almost like it's the opposite of what we think. We think that normally symptoms would be when we're sick, but it turns out that actually some of these symptoms are part of the healing phase. So we're actually getting
Hmm.
better. So how come some of these symptoms that just keep going on and on and on for a very long time?
A lot of people think that the stress is causing your symptoms, and in a way it is, but your symptoms really start when it gets resolved. Let's say I'm at work and I'm like really struggling to get this website to work. Like I can't figure out like what line of code I need to fix in order to get everything to work. I'm conflict active. "Ugh, who made this code? They're so stupid. Da, 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 da." And I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure it out. And then I figure it out. That's when I'm going to have the diarrhea. That's when I'm going to have the gut pain. Because when I was stressed out, I was developing extra gut cells. And then when the conflict got resolved, that's when it's like, okay, we don't need these extra gut cells anymore, and starts to get rid of it.
Mhm. Right. So it becomes the symptoms stay, or it becomes chronic in what case?
So the next day I go into work and the same thing happens, or something similar happens at home. We like develop this filter, this way of seeing our problems, and it just kind of spills into the other parts of our life. But for people with Crohn's disease, they start to perceive foods as hard to digest, and then you're eating 3 or 4 or 5 times a day, and that's like 5 opportunities to have this cell proliferation and cell loss happen in your gut, and that's when it really becomes a mess.
Mhm. Okay. So, and then there is such a thing as tracks and triggers. So, how do you explain those? What are those?
So tracks or triggers, they are things that remind you of the initial conflict. So all the tracks that I have, I can remember are from like breakups. So the first one that I realized that I had, it took me a while to find it, was coffee. And so when I was at the height of my holistic psycho, food phobia phase, I had a girlfriend that had a lot of acne, and we thought it was caused by coffee. And so I would catch her get like drinking coffee like behind my back, and I get like really angry at her. And so one time we broke up because of it. Like that was like our big fight that like spurred the breakup. And so every time my body saw a cup of coffee, it would go, "Oh my god, like something. This is it. Last time we had a cup of coffee, we went through a breakup. Like be careful." And it runs, and your biology will run the special program.
Right. So the tracks and triggers, they're there to actually help us avoid that situation that we were in. And they
Hmm.
can be, all the senses. So it's smell. So coffee can be taste and smell. You could have been drinking coffee when went through a breakup, and it sets coffee as a trigger. I want to ask you about a few more examples with people you worked with and
Okay.
their scenarios of conflicts that they had in regards to indigestible anger. So
Okay.
maybe a lot of other people can relate, and they can
Yeah.
understand that, yeah, maybe this is what I'm going through right now.
I see a lot of people, their conflicts involve football, like American football. I don't know if you've ever played like on a competitive sports team before, but it can be a very stressful environment. And you have like so much time, blood, sweat, and tears invested in this thing. And like you could just have like an injury, and like boom, like your career is over. It is done. And so some of my students were, you know, gonna go to college football or whatever, and then their senior year of high school, they break their arm or something, and they can't play anymore, and their life is just turned upside down. And so one student, he broke his arm playing football. So for 3 months, he was trying to figure out like what he was going to do with his life. He had no idea what he was going to do with his life, and he finally figured out he was going to do this. He got the job. It's like, all right, I'm going to start on Monday. And to celebrate, he went to like a burger joint with his sister to celebrate, and he had a burger and a milkshake. And then that night when he was driving home, that's when the symptoms started. And so he didn't know German new medicine at this time. So the whole time he's like, "Oh man, I guess dairy isn't good for me. I guess because I had a milkshake. It must have been the milkshake. It must have been the hamburger. That's like the only thing I can think of. But in reality, it was him finally being like, "Yes, I have a new career. I don't have to digest this filthy event that happened to me."
Right. So breaking the arm for him meant the career is over. So he was
Mhm.
angry at the situation, but there was nothing he could do about it. So that's where the indigestible comes in. It
Mhm.
was an indigestible situation. So then
Mhm.
when he found what he was going to do with his life, that was the resolution. So he went into the healing phase, and the healing phase comes with the symptoms of Crohn's.
Mhm. Mhm.
Am I getting that right?
Yes. That is very good. Yeah, just and so he kept so this is where it gets tricky. So he just got his new career. Everything's grown, he's going to start. And now all of a sudden there's blood flying out of his butt and he's like, "Oh my god, I don't think I'll be able to work at this new job." Now the conflict's all active again. And now he thinks foods are causing it. This is where it turns into a train wreck. And people
Right.
can go downhill really fast.
And that's very true, because sometimes it feels like you've made a decision and you're set with that and you like it, but then something reminds you, hey, maybe you're not that,
Mhm.
set as you thought you were. So, so um, I think that's it. I think we have a pretty good picture of how Crohn's looks like
Yeah.
for people in both phases, healing and the active phase, which is
Mhm.
a phase where they're stressed. So in this last example that you brought, his active phase would be those couple of 3 months that he was looking for
Mhm.
a solution to the
Mhm.
indigestible anger. So that would be the active phase, and then the resolution, and then he goes into the healing phase. Is there
Mhm.
anything you want to add before we?
So so even people who are aware of German new medicine, like they might not know when they're conflict active. Like I just got through a war and you think I would, I was like conflict active for a month going through the war. I got out of the war and I was safe. I haven't had any big healing symptoms come up. It really depends on how our subconscious mind and interprets these things. But as far as that one student was concerned, he the only symptom he had is that he was like obsessed about fixing this problem. Maybe he had a little bit of insomnia and a little bit of a loss of appetite or something like that. But he had no symptoms in the very no symptoms that are going to send you to the hospital
Right.
for the intestines.
And insomnia from the perspective of German new medicine in this case would,
Hmm.
in the active phase, would just happen so you can have more time to find a solution to the problem that you have. So we look at
Exactly.
it as insomnia being something bad, but in this case is to find a solution. Even insomnia can be, like, for a lot of people, they can be in active phase for a long time,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And it could be 20 years
Hmm.
before they actually find a solution.
Yeah.
So,
And a lot of people, insomnia becomes like the con like a new special program. And
any advice for anyone on how to deal with their emotional stress?
yeah, so the first thing is to identify it. You have to identify it, and there's a lot of different strategies to do that. First thing I ask people is like, what do you obsess about? Like, what is on your mind 24/7? And I'm usually thinking about two different things, and usually it falls under romantic relationships, job, family, and then like the disease itself and foods. It usually falls under those categories. It's very rarely something else. So it's just like, what are you upset? Like, what are you obsessing about? Like, what keeps you up at night? And so once you identify it, that's when we need to ask our brain to start looking for a solution for us. So how can I make this conflict impossible to experience? And how do I do this enjoyably? Because all your brain is doing right now is just like, oh, I'm going to worry about it, and it just worries and it worries and it worries, and it goes down this dark hole. So you have to start guiding. You got to like hold his hand and pull it out of the hole and ask it, because it can't ignore a question. How do I resolve this? How do I make this conflict impossible to experience? And how do I do it enjoyably? And your brain will be like, oh, all right, well, I didn't think about that. Oh, that looks good. And it starts ignoring all the negative stuff. And depending on what the situation is, it can be very easy, or it can be a more drawn out process. Like if someone's in like the middle of a divorce or something and there's like kids involved, it's like, you know, or, some people, it's just their food phobias that are giving them their symptoms. And for a lot of people, the symptoms start when the conflict gets resolved. So if you catch it really early, I mean, it's just like, just sit in bed for a few weeks and you'll be fine.
Right. I really like what you said about people having ruminating thoughts and stressing about their disease itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also in regards to sometimes the conflict is hard to find because it might have happened 20 years ago and people don't remember anymore what
That was
happened.
me.
Right. Um, so I have one last question for you. And are you ready? Because it's kind of tough.
Okay.
How do you feel about coffee now?
How do I feel about coffee now? I drink it every morning
Great.
and
So
it's
it's not a
great.
track for you anymore.
No. But
Good.
it was very weird how, because I was like, I know coffee is safe. I know coffee isn't giving me symptoms.
Yeah.
And then it was like randomly one day in the shower while I was driving, I was just like, oh yeah, I remember like seeing her picture, and she had this huge cappuccino. It's just and it just sparked the fight. And that was it. I just had to realize that, and I could have as much coffee as I wanted.
Right. I still remember when I started to be aware of my emotions and while I'm eating, because there was a time when I ate only a few ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I remember that every time I would eat, I would either be on my phone or I would have a conversation with someone,
Mm-hmm.
and I would, I have this app with news app, and some sad or scary news would pop up, and my
Mm-hmm.
my body would just feel that, and
Mm-hmm.
then my body would link that to that food, and then next time I can't eat it anymore because I'm intolerant to it all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I see how that works. I mean, I experienced it
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I mean, I had no food intolerances until I read the specific carbohydrate diet, and I just became terrified of starches. Like it was overnight. It was like I was 2 weeks on that diet, and I was like, oh right, okay, I feel good. And then like I had like one piece of bread, and I had to like call off of work for like 2 weeks. And even when I had like sourdough bread, the only reason sourdough bread worked for me is because like I read Weston A. Price's book, and I was like, oh my god, they're eating sourdough bread. It's pre-digested. And I just believed that it was safe.
Yeah, it was interesting to me because my best friend, one thing was interesting. My best friend, she started having panic attacks almost the same day as me, like within one day.
Oh wow.
And she would eat everything, and I was trying to convince her, and that was before I even knew German new medicine, and I
Mm-hmm.
was trying to convince her that all her symptoms are from food, and
Mm-hmm.
and I was convinced that they were from food, and she never stopped eating nothing. She just kept eating everything, and then at some point I started asking myself, so how come she's doing she's not eliminating any food? I am, but my symptoms are still there. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what made me look into it, into maybe I'm linking some emotions to that food. So that's why I stopped eating it.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
it looks like we can talk about this forever because
Well,
we're both very passionate about German new medicine.
it's funny that we're talking about panic attacks, because I had a friend who was always giving me crap about my food stuff. He'd always like throw it in my face, be like, you're pretty skinny for how healthy you eat, Mike. I was super skinny. And so one day I remember he started to get an itchy butthole and panic attacks. And he's a big dude, it's like kind of surprising that he would get panic attacks. And it all happened after he got a call from his dad in the middle of the night about his grandma going into the hospital. And, I didn't know GNM at the time. I was, being a holistic crazy person. Yeah, he had, I think he had a territorial anger conflict, because he was kind of mad how his dad delivered the message to him. I remember he was like really mad about it. He's like, "How insensitive, dad. Like you couldn't have waited to when I was awake or something like that." But yeah, he would get panic attacks. He was reminded the track was him coming into the apartment, I think, when he would come to the apartment because that is where he got the bad news. Yeah.
So the interesting thing about these conflicts is that it depends on the perception of the person. So me and you can go through the same situation, and I'll be
Mhm.
happy I got out of a breakup, and
Mhm.
you will collect tracks and triggers with coffee and everything else.
Mhm.
So the perception, and this is what I talk in my other podcast, is that we can change our perception to things. And I think even you talked about this with different words, but something like that. So if you want to share this, would be great, because this can help someone who is going through a conflict that they can work on their own. There's conflicts, there's situations that need someone to help them. They need a professional to guide them through that. But then there's things that they can just work on their own. So this changing, lowering the importance, I think that's the
Mhm.
words you use.
Mhm. Yeah, the way I like to look at it is, we're kind of like running on autopilot. We have these habits where we just run on autopilot. Like something happen, you can't like logically think about everything that happens to you, so you're just run on autopilot, and we call them habits. But like the reason why you believe so, like why you react that way is because of a belief that you have that got instilled in you somehow. Maybe it was something you were taught in your culture or in your family, or a traumatic event happened to you, or maybe you read a really good book or really watched a really good documentary, and like this belief, it's like, okay, I have this belief now, and I'm going to be offended when this or that happens. Like if you get really emotional about something, I like to look for the belief that makes me that like gets offended. Like what belief is getting offended, and is that completely like how can I change that? Or because everything is true and everything is false in its own light.
Right, a lot of times people perceive losing a job as that's it,
Mhm.
my life is over. So
Mhm.
changing the perspective on it, lowering the importance
Mhm.
of that, can help. It gets even easier to find a new job
Oh
when
yeah.
you don't have such a pressure on yourself. So I said before that that was my last question.
Mhm.
And then we continued for another 10 minutes. Let's wrap it up.